I love climbing and I love progressing, so I've put a lot of time and effort over the last 6 years to keep that going, but somewhere along the way I kind of lost track of my wrists. For years they felt strong, never bothered me, I never really thought about them. Then I started to notice things like a little bit of pain while doing push-ups, some weakness or instability on slopers, and ultimately pain while I was doing computer work. It reached a point where I knew I had to make a change, so for the last couple of months now, I've been focusing on 4 things that seem to really help. The forearm muscles get really tight with a lot of climbing, and all those muscles cross the wrist. So over time, this will make your wrists less flexible, which I think is what was happening with me when my wrists started to hurt during push-ups. I like to do this little stretching routine a few times a week, or at least after every climbing or training session. I start with each finger individually, maybe stretching for 10 or 15 seconds each. Then I stretch them in pairs of 2, then I stretch them in pairs of 3, and then finally I stretch all 4 fingers at once. I usually do 2 rounds of this, stretching a little bit longer and a little bit harder on the second round. I also like this stretch that I learned from lattice training. It's a bit awkward to get into, but it's a really good stretch for the forearms for both like elbow and wrist. I try to put pressure from my hips on the elbows to really aid in the stretch. I usually do this one twice, maybe holding for 45 seconds or so. Although I think it might be less important, I think it's still a good idea to do some stretching of the extensors as well. Again, I usually do 2 rounds on each wrist, holding for somewhere between 15 and 30 seconds each time. I'm gonna put it in this same category, but it's kind of a bonus. A use of something like this arm aid or a Theragun can be super helpful in loosening up the muscles as well. The wrist is a complex joint that can move in multiple directions. Unfortunately, climbing alone doesn't do a great job of keeping it strong and well-rounded in kind of all those different directions. But fortunately, there are 6 exercises that do just that. The bad news is these exercises are kind of boring, but the good news is you can probably do them all at home. First up are the forearm curls. You might be familiar with these. You really want to do them slow and controlled, especially focusing on the eccentric or lowering portion of the exercise. Start with a comfortable weight, like maybe 10 pounds, and do 3 sets of 10. The goal with all these exercises will be to increase the amount of weight used gradually over time. Next up, we have the extensor curls, and I think they might be the most important. The forearm muscles get worked a lot with rock climbing. The extensors only a little bit when going into the crimp position, but over the long term, I think those muscles are less likely to build up the same strength as your forearms. So we got forearm flexion and extension. Next, we need rotation. I like to use a broom for these exercises because it's easy to slide your hand along to make it more or less difficult depending where you put it. And I like to focus on just one side of the exercise instead of going all the way over and rotating in both directions down through the full range and then back to the up position, slow and controlled the whole time. To round out the movements that the wrist can do, we now have this tilt up in the front with the broom or the tilt up in the back with the broom. Again, I'm going to do a set of 10 or so reps, probably 3 sets, and over time looking to increase the resistance by moving your hand further and further towards the end of the broom. The last exercise I've been doing frequently for the wrists is sort of this bonus combo exercise that I personally have found really valuable. I kind of prefer it to the extensor curls a little bit in the way of just how it makes my wrist feel. It can sometimes feel like it's getting put under a little too much strain if I'm using the weights that are heavy enough to get me a good muscle burn. So hanging these heavy weights and then contracting up and back into this extended position, I find to be a pretty nice feeling workout and to be something that seems to be improving my strength in that direction over time without putting extra strain on the wrist. I guess all in, that's 7 exercises instead of 6, but I like to do those about twice a week. The older I get, the more serious I take my warm-ups, and they now include a very specific focus on the wrist. I make sure to spend a few minutes just rotating around in all the various directions and kind of exploring those ranges of motion that we talked about in the 6 different directions. Then I'll weight the wrists a little bit with some push-ups, give them some stretch the other way with some pull-ups, and then do this cool tendon glide kind of exercise warm-up that I came across recently. That one feels pretty good for the wrists to really get them juiced up and ready to do some climbing. One of the aspects that I least expected of this whole injury was what I'm going to call aggravating activities. For me, working on a laptop became quite painful, and I could see the correlation once I started to pay attention that the more work I did on the laptop, the worse my wrist felt. And then the worse my other wrist felt, so I put 2 and 2 together, like this can't only be a climbing thing, there's other stuff that's aggravating this as well. Getting a proper little cushion pad and an ergonomic setup where everything's at 90-degree angles and nothing weird really goes a long way towards minimizing the aggravation that might be happening to your wrists without you even really thinking about it. In fact, I even found that while I'm sleeping, I could be doing some damage to my wrists. I tend to sleep in this curled up positions with my wrist tucked in under or nestled away somewhere, and I wake up and I'm like, oh my gosh, my wrist is hurting, my nerve can be hurting. So for a few weeks I was sleeping with a wrist guard on every night that prevented my wrist from getting in those wild positions or staying tucked away all night. And especially in the rehab phases, I really found it was super valuable to wear that and wake up with a nice recovered wrist instead of one that was cranky from being in a weird position all night. I don't still do it every night, but if my wrists are feeling kind of tweaky, I might put one on just to be safe. Of course, the other aggravating activity can be climbing itself. You'll probably have to cut back on the volume of climbing a little bit if you're noticing some wrist pain, and just pay attention to the moves you're doing. Like a mantle or a bad sloper might be especially difficult or painful to use. You may not want to mantle early on in your session till you're totally warmed up. You may just want to be mindful of your positioning. If your wrists are feeling weak or prone to injury, you really just want to be aware of that stuff that might hurt it and make sure that you're not doing it until your wrists get stronger so that they can take it. As my wrists do continue to get stronger, I'm hoping to incorporate some handstand work as well as some false grip type exercises to really get them strong and robust in all the facets that I can. And if you've had a similar experience or any suggestions of your own, I'd really love to hear them. Thanks for watching. Maybe check out another video.